Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I'll have earned your subscription. What I'm going to talk about today is part 16 of my neck through guitar build. And what I'll be doing specifically is what I like to call pre-assembly. What pre-assembly is, it's basically what the name implies. I'm going to be installing all of the components, or almost all of the components, prior to applying the finish. Then once I have all the components installed and everything fits and I'm pretty satisfied with how the guitar is turning out, I can remove all those components, do the final sanding, and then apply the finish. Now the reason I do this is because the process of assembling a guitar can be somewhat destructive if you're not careful. You've got to do a lot of pilot hole drilling, test fitting, and things like that. So if I were to apply the finish first and then do the assembly, there's a chance I could drop a screwdriver or a file or a drill and damage the finish. So in truth, even though we don't like to damage any part of the guitar as we're assembling it, it's better to experience that and then repair it now than it is later after the finish has been applied. So I'll do the pre-assembly, get all the holes drilled, all the screws installed, everything assembled, and then I can take it apart, apply that finish. Once that's done and once the finish has had a chance to cure, I can then do the final assembly, which is going to go much faster and it will be much easier. So let me bring you in and we'll get started. The first component I have to install is the hip shot bridge, and to do that I have to remove the saddles. And then I like to coat the threads of the mounting screws with some paste furniture wax. That just makes them easier to install. It also coats the threads in the wood with the wax, which helps to seal it. And once the base plate is installed, I can then reinstall the saddles. And I only need to do the high and low E string saddles because I'm going to use those to help position the pickups here in just a minute. The humbuckers are going to be installed using pickup rings. So I'll install those with the screws and springs and get those ready to mount into the body. Then of course I've got to thread the wire through the holes that were drilled into the body. And once I've got the pickups installed, one of the things that I noticed is that the screws mounting them to the ring are just a little bit too tall. So I took a drill with a bit large enough and drilled just shallow holes where those screws contact the wood so I could give them enough clearance. Now the way that I route the humbucker pockets, I've got a little bit of clearance around the pickups so that I can shift them side to side and up and down in order to get them aligned properly. And in order to align them, I like to stretch a length of thread from the nut, or where the nut will be, to the saddle. And then I can shift the vertical positioning of the pickups before I mark their location with a steel marking awl. It's critically important to make sure that the holes that you drill for mounting anything into wood are the correct size for the screws that you're going to use. So you want to do some research to find out what size screws you're installing and then what size drill bit you need to use to drill the pilot holes. The next component I need to install is the tuning machines, and as you can see here, they don't really fit into the holes that I drilled, and that's by design. I like to ream out the holes to size, and the tool that I use to ream them out will form a hole that's slightly tapered so the tuning pegs will fit nice and snug. And then before I can permanently mount the tuning machines, I need to make sure that they're aligned properly to one another as well as the shape of the headstock, and I just do this by eye. And then once I've got the tuners aligned the way I want them, I'll take a mechanical drafting pencil and mark the position of the holes that'll be drilled into the back of the headstock in order to mount those tiny little screws that hold the tuner into position. And of course, I'm using my paste furniture wax to lubricate the threads before I install them. Now, in truth, you don't really have to install all of the nuts and bolts and screws during the pre-assembly process, but in all honesty, I highly recommend that you do it because you want to make sure that everything is going to fit properly and that you're not going to have any clearance problems or ill-fitting components. Any component that requires you to drill holes to mount it definitely needs to be done during the pre-assembly. Here I'm doing the truss rod cover, and I decided to reshape it a little bit because I felt it was a little bit too large. So once I had the shape right, I could then mark the position of the holes and then drill the pilot holes for mounting the truss rod cover to the headstock. Up next was the jack plate, and I'm using one of those football-shaped jack plates, which is held in with 2 screws, so it's a really easy install. And with any screw that you're installing, it's ideal to hand install them with a screwdriver. And if you use an electric drill, you've got to be really careful not to use too much force, which could damage the screws. Next up, it was time to start installing the electronic components. And since I'm going to be removing everything later on, I'm not going to be soldering the pickup leads to the controls just yet. So I just taped those out of the way. And then I proceeded with installing the pots and the switches and getting everything positioned correctly. Now at this stage, you could probably get away with just finger tightening all the nuts and bolts, but I'm going to use a spanner wrench here just to make sure that the potentiometers are secured in place. Now there are a lot of schematics out there that you can use for wiring. I like to use Complete Guitar Wiring, which is a book written by Jerry Hayes and has an enormous number of schematics that are outstanding resource for wiring up just about any kind of situation you would ever encounter with an electric guitar. Now to prepare for wiring, I like to get all my wires cut and the ends are tinned. I also like to tin the lugs and the back of the pots and get all that ready for soldering in the wiring. And the first wires that I'm going to solder in are going to be all the different ground wires that will connect all the pots and the switch to the ground lug on the jack. So those are all pre-tinned and then soldered into position. It's a bit of a tight fit, but it's not too bad. Now this video isn't going to be a tutorial on how to properly solder guitar electronics because that would take too long. If you're new to the topic, and I highly recommend that you really learn and practice this skill, because if you don't, you will have problems down the road that can be difficult to troubleshoot. But if you need to learn how to solder, an excellent resource is Dylan from Dylan Talks Tone. He has a bunch of videos on the topic, and I'll put a link to his channel in the description below. He also has a Skillshare course that you can take on this topic specifically related to soldering guitar electronics. And I'll put that in the a link to that in the description as well, but down below. But once I have the ground wires and my capacitor all soldered in, the next thing I'm going to do is solder the signal wires. And what I'll do is I'll cut those to length, strip the ends, tin the exposed wire, and then I'll solder all those into place. And I want to make sure that everything is connected properly and that it's going to work before I disassemble the guitar. Now, like I said, I'm not going to be attaching or installing or connecting the pickups to the electronics. So I have to trust my experience that the controls are going to work correctly. And the thing is a guitar circuit is incredibly simple. Even when you do exotic wiring like coil splitting or changing the phase of the pickups and that sort of thing. It's such a simple circuit. It's not that difficult to do. So I'm relatively confident that it's going to work fine, and if it doesn't, I should be able to troubleshoot it pretty easily. But we'll get to that later on down the road when I'm doing the final assembly. So here I've just finished the jack, and now I'm ready to install the strap buttons, and that's one of those components that can be easily forgotten. But it's just like installing all the other components. You just have to measure out the position of the mounting hole, drill the correct sized pilot hole, and then install the component into place. Okay, so the pre-assembly is finished. All the holes have been drilled, everything's been installed, mounted in, and everything fits. And I don't have to worry about damaging the finish later on, having to drill holes. There are a couple of things that were omitted from that process. First of all, I still need to make the nut, but that can come later. I don't have to do it for the pre-assembly. And I did not install the string through ferrules, mainly because the holes for the string through ferrules have not yet been drilled. Normally that's something I would have done during the CNC process, but because of the shape of this neck and everything, I decided I was going to wait, and since I have the holes drilled in the top, I would use those holes with my pin alignment system on my drill press, and then I would just drill those holes into the back of the body. So that can happen a little bit later. And the other thing is, as I was installing the electronics, I just suddenly discovered I don't have a control cavity cover made yet. I had some covers and I thought I could possibly use one, but none of them fit. So I'm going to have to go ahead and make one. And I think that's the work that's going to happen in the next episode, which will be part 17. I'm going to drill the holes for the string through ferrules, make the control cavity cover, and then I'm going to sand the entire body and hopefully start to apply the finish. And I haven't totally decided on what I'm going to use for the finish. I'm either going to use the polymerized tung oil that I've been, using quite a bit lately. In fact, that's what I used on this guitar, and I really like how it turned out. But another possibility is that I'm going to use Z-epoxy finishing resin, although I think I'm going to have to order some because I'm almost out. But I really like Z-epoxy finishing resin. It has a look that is very similar to a hand-rubbed oil finish. The difference being it's an epoxy, so when it dries very hard, and it offers, I think, better protection than any oil finish that's out there. But what I'm going to do is leave you with the disassembly of this guitar. I'm going to do it in fast motion. So check that out. And until the next episode, click that thumbs up button, hit the subscribe button if you're new to the channel, and take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for episode 17.